Before we searched for crystals, before we saved the princess, before we explored the frozen mountains, and before we scavenged the arid deserts, before we caught them all, before we killed God, and before we saved the world and before we watched it collapse, there was Akalabeth, World of Doom. Akalabeth was not by any means the first computer role-playing game. To paraphrase the late fantasy author Robert Jordan, it was not the beginning, but it was a beginning. While mostly forgotten now and only remembered as a prelude to the far more prestigious Ultima series, Akalabeth was a humble beginning that set the stage for the RPG genre as we know it today. While not a direct influence on many of the games we enjoy today, many fundamental RPG design elements can be traced back to Ultima and by extension, Akalabeth. Akalabeth in turn borrows heavily from Dungeons & Dragons and Tolkien. Like I said, this game is not the beginning, but if we take all of human culture and put it on a roadmap, and then zoom in on the fantasy genre, and then zoom further into role-playing games, and zoom in even further still into early computer role-playing games, Akalabeth stands out as a noteworthy early attempt at an interactive dungeon-crawling adventure. It's as good a place as any to start a series on RPG criticism and analysis. If we as a people have learned anything from the digital era, it's that the history of any given subject is as much a web of interconnected nodes as it is a timeline of cause and effect. Role-playing video games as a cultural phenomenon are still quite young when taking into account the grand history of human art, yet they still seem so monumentally established and old when I look at them from a personal scale. Akalabeth is almost 40 years old. That's about a decade and a half worth of time before I existed as even a thought in the heads of my parents. I've been playing role-playing games for as long as I can remember. From my perspective, they've always been around. The RPG web is growing thicker and wider with each passing day, and despite a lifetime of enjoying these games, I often feel like I've just barely penetrated the surface of what the genre even has to offer. I speak of RPGs through this historical lens because that's part of my objective here. I want to navigate this web and explore what each piece has to contribute to the greater whole. I want to examine the foundations from which we've built upon and evolved, and what we've decided to leave behind. I want to rediscover what's been lost and forgotten in the middle. Perhaps most importantly, I want to see where the hell we're headed. But at their core, these videos will be review first, retrospective second. I'll be discussing these games as they were, and the merits they had at the time of their release, but I'd also like to provide an honest take on whether or not they're still worth engaging with in 2017 and beyond. I'd like to discuss the gameplay and mechanics through which these games operate, and the writing and storytelling through which they move us. I want to analyze what impact these games have made both within the genre and culturally as well. And, when relevant, what these games have meant to me as an individual. That's a lot for one person to talk about. One could say it's too much for one person to talk about. But I'm going to be taking this one game at a time in no particular order other than where my interests take me and what seems right at the time. No matter how this goes, I'm sure it'll be one hell of a journey. My name is Razin, and this is RPG Rewind. Akalabeth is the fourth part of J.R.R. Tolkien's world-building exercise, The Silmarillion.
I love plagiarism.
It's a relatively short segment of the book, but it does the important job of tying the events of The Silmarillion into the more recognized stories of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. It tells the tale of the great island kingdom of Numenor. The Númenóreans were a human people that grew jealous of the elves for their immortality, and over time they developed an antagonistic relationship with the gods who refused to grant them eternal life. Seeing this as an opportunity, the Dark Lord Sauron infiltrated his way into the kingdom and convinced the king to launch a massive military campaign against the land of the gods. Eru, the supreme deity of the Middle-earth cosmology, responds in kind by obliterating the Armada and plunging Númenor into the sea. Those in Númenor who remained in service to the gods, a small oppressed group known as the Faithful, escaped the cataclysm and founded the Middle-earth kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor. It's a tragic tale about the hubris of man, about how even our greatest achievements can crumble and decay with time. Akalabeth World of Doom, on the other hand, is the first commercial role-playing game made by Richard Garriott. The game is by no means an adaptation, however, and the title seems to have been only chosen in homage. Though perhaps this game, in its own way, is Garriott's Númenor. A great achievement for the time, definitely, but one that would eventually be forgotten in favor of more influential adventures. And for a young Richard Garriott, Akalabeth was quite the achievement. Garriott was the son of an astronaut and became a computer enthusiast in high school. He spent his time programming unofficial Dungeons & Dragons games that were essentially prototypes to Akalabeth. Garriott worked at a computer store during the summer, and when he showed his boss a demo of the game he was working on, his boss offered him the chance to sell it as a commercial product in the store. After finishing up the game, writing a very brief instruction manual, asking his mother to draw some crude cover art, and wrapping it all up in a Ziploc bag, his game was made available for purchase. Only 12 copies of the original Akalabeth ever sold, but as fate would have it, the story does not end there. Through sheer luck, a copy of the game made its way out west and into the hands of a software publisher called California Pacific Computer Company. They contacted Garriott and his parents and offered to publish the game in mass quantities, to which he agreed. To everyone's surprise, it sold over 30,000 copies. By the time Richard Garriott was 20 years old, he had managed to make $150,000 through Akalabeth sales alone. If you take into account inflation, that's about $445,000 today. Akalabeth is the first in a series of many successes that would eventually allow Garriott to follow in his father's footsteps and travel into space himself in 2008 as a private astronaut. But playing it today, it's a little hard to see how something so simple left such a great legacy. How is Akalabeth as a game, you might ask? Well, while it's an interesting curiosity of early game design, I regret to inform you that it's a lot less engaging than the story of its development. The game was originally released for Apple II computers and in 1998 was remastered for Windows as part of an Ultima collection. The footage you're seeing here is from the remaster, which cleaned up the visuals and retroactively added in Ultima 3 music for the soundtrack. The title was also changed, redubbing the game Ultima 0, Akalabeth. Unless you really want the authentic experience, this is the version I recommend you play if you choose to do so. From what I can tell, they're mostly the same experience, but one is just a bit nicer to look at. Both versions of the game are available to download for free from GOG.com, including digital versions of the original manual and some free wallpapers to boot. The story is simple, but as good of an excuse as any to risk your young life crawling through dungeons. In the past, the Dark Lord Mondain spread death and destruction throughout the land of Akalabeth. Lord British, a fictional persona of Garriott that appears throughout his work, managed to defeat Mondain and send him into hiding. However, the monsters of Mondain's creation still lurk in the underground dungeons of Akalabeth. You are an adventurer seeking knighthood, so Lord British tasks you with descending into the depths and killing certain monsters before you take on a dreaded Balrog ripped straight from the pages of Fellowship of the Ring. It's a simple premise, but one not too out of the ordinary for a young creator, plagiarism and all. Lord British and the evil sorcerer Mondain would both go on to serve important roles in Garriott's next game, the original Ultima, and it's their presence here, however small, that ties Akalabeth into the greater Ultima continuity. Despite the land of Akalabeth itself never again being referenced and the protagonist of this game never reappearing, this game is considered the earliest point in the Ultima saga. When you create a new character in Akalabeth, the game asks what your lucky number is. In reality, the number you input is the seed from which the overworld and dungeon layout of the game is generated. For those unfamiliar with this term, in computer science most random number generation is not truly random, but pseudo-random. Pseudo-random number generation starts with an initial value, or a seed, and produces an output that appears random but truly isn't. This means that if you start up your copy of Akalabeth and tell the game that your lucky number is 2, you'll be given the same exact world as the one I'm playing through in this video. I always enjoy when games that make use of procedural generation allow you to input a seed, and I wish more of them did so today. If you've never done it before, get some friends together in a Skype or Discord chat and play through a roguelike of your choice all using the same seed. It's a lot of fun, and it takes a traditionally single-player experience and makes it into a group effort. The next option is for your difficulty, 1 to 10. I wasn't entirely sure what this exactly impacted over the course of the game, but I started my first few runs on difficulty level 5 before getting tired of restarting over and over again, and I moved it down to 2 and eventually 3. I think the difficulty has an impact on how much damage you take from enemies and how much damage you deliver, but reviewing my footage, I'm not entirely sure if that's the case. Your final task is to roll for your stats. This is the aspect of the game where its D&D influence is most easily seen. Your hit points determine your starting health, your strength determines how much damage you deal, dexterity determines your accuracy, stamina determines your defense, wisdom determines the length of the main quest, oddly enough, and your gold is your starting money. Just like in Dungeons & Dragons, these values are generated with a range between 4 and 24, emulating the 4 six-sided dice you would be rolling if you were playing it as a tabletop game. You can re-roll over and over again with no penalty, and I suggest you do so. The difference between having 15 dexterity and 20 dexterity means a lot more than you'd think in this game, and will save you a fair amount of frustration if you just keep re-rolling until you get something decent. Though, paradoxically, you're going to want to have as low of a wisdom score as possible, which I'll explain in a little bit as well. You then choose if you want to play as a fighter or a mage, and this is where the flaws in the game's design become apparent. The fighter is able to control every type of weapon in the game, but has no control over the magical amulet item. The mage, on the other hand, is unable to use rapiers and bows, but is able to control what effect will occur when they use magical amulets. There is absolutely no reason to play as a fighter in Akalabeth. The magic amulet is so crucial to a successful run of this game that it would be foolish to forego its maximum utility in favor of slightly more offensive power. I cannot stress enough how different of an experience you will have based off your choice in class. When you play as a fighter, Akalabeth is a brutal dungeon crawler that should last you an hour or two. When you play as a mage, Akalabeth is a game about getting enough gold to fund a magical escapade that will make you into a god that lasts maybe 10 to 20 minutes. I'll discuss this more as we get into the dungeon, so let's wrap up character creation first. After creating our character, our adventure starts out in a shop. There are towns scattered across the overworld, and every time you enter one you end up in the same shop screen. Every shop sells the same goods for the same prices. Whatever you decide to buy with your initial bit of cash, for the love of God buy enough food. Akalabeth runs on a hunger timer system, and if at any point your supply of food hits 0, you immediately die of starvation. It's a very basic attempt at a starvation mechanic, a common way of ensuring that players explore with purpose and adding another layer of resource management to your travels, but it's also a little silly to imagine our hero withering away and dying as soon as their last bag of trail mix is empty. Upon leaving the shop, you enter the Overworld Screen for the first time. The Overworld Screen is a 20 by 20 grid with different icons representing mountains, towns, Lord British's castle, and different entrances to the dungeon. There's really nothing else of note here, it mostly exists just to get you from place to place and to waste your precious food with every step. Before you enter the dungeon, however, you should stop in at the castle. During your first visit, Lord British will ask the player to input the character's name. I was a little surprised when this came up my first time. I figured that if I wasn't naming my character during character creation, I wouldn't be naming them at all. To have the game's name entry as a response to an in-universe question presented to the character is a surprisingly organic way of going about it. You see it a lot nowadays, especially in Japanese role-playing games, but nice little touches like that tend to stand out more when you aren't expecting them in something so archaic by today's standards. Lord British then provides you with the details of your quest, and this is where your wisdom stat has an impact. There are 10 types of monsters in Akalabeth. In order from weakest to strongest, we have a skeleton, a thief, a giant rat, a viper, an orc, a carrion crawler, a gremlin, a mimic, a demon, and the balrog. Lord British tasks you with killing each of these foes in that order, and when you report back to him after a successful hunt, he will raise all of your stats by 1. But not all players will have to kill all 10 monsters. The higher your wisdom stat is, the further along in the quest chain your character will be at the start of the game. This means that player with terrible wisdom will have to kill all 10 monsters, and characters with a higher stat may only have to kill 4 or 5. Here's the problem. Lord British raising your stats is the only reliable source of character progression throughout the game, which means a character sent out to kill a gremlin as their very first task will be forced to do so with 6 less skill points in all their stats than characters who had to kill all 10 monsters. I am shocked by how poorly thought out this decision was. It completely destroys the balance of power escalation. The harder enemies are naturally lower in the dungeon, so even if you do have decent stats, it might prove difficult to even get down there from the sheer number of enemies you encounter alone. The best possible starting loadout for a new character in Akalabeth is having wisdom as absolutely low as possible, and all your other stats as absolutely high as you can get them. That's how I got through my first playthrough, at least. The actual combat is fairly simple, yet has a few quirks to it that I didn't see coming. Enemies freely roam the dungeon, but when you run into them you don't enter a separate battle screen. Each action you take passes time in the rest of the dungeon, which means other enemies can flank you or move behind you and start attacking as well. Because there's only one of you and anywhere from 1 to 4 monsters attacking at once, one of the most strategic elements to the gameplay is proper character positioning. Because enemies can't stack up on top of one another, the ideal place to be when combat starts is in a room with only one entrance. Enemies will line up single file and wait for their chance to get their stab at you. If you find yourself surrounded by 4 enemies, you can only ever deal with one of them at a time, and you're in a very bad position. It's a great way to wind up dead, and when you're exploring unfamiliar territory, it's very likely to find yourself surrounded faster than you can imagine. It's part of the fun, though. Enemies will run if you get them real low on HP, which can be exploited as well. The AI usually isn't smart enough to maneuver properly, which means that it will often be stuck in a state of perpetually moving in the opposite direction from which they fought you. However, because enemies cannot move past one another, an enemy in a space between you and another enemy will be stuck moving in place if they decide to flee. These stuck enemies can be used as temporary buffers while you deal with enemies coming from other directions. While this is a nice unintended quirk of the dungeon crawling system that can be exploited for extra strategic depth, in most cases fleeing enemies just end up stuck in a corner somewhere, waiting for you to put them out of their misery. Outside of the movement and positional strategy, there isn't much depth to the combat system. It's a matter of using your best weapon and hoping you miss less than the enemy does before one of you dies, and trust me, with how this game works you will miss a lot. After spending a minute or two doing the song and dance, you're either dead or left with a decision, to keep going through the dungeon or to try to make an escape. This is so bare bones by today's standard, but it's important to remember that this basic exploration and combat was a big draw for people at the time. The idea of playing an RPG where all the dice rolls were automated and the action was dictated by a computer rather than by a human was exciting. There was a novelty to exploring a virtual space even with such a limited amount of interaction. Some enemies do have a few tricks up their sleeves, however. The thief can, well, steal from you. This can be a fun problem early on in the game where you're probably not well equipped and they can steal all your weapons. About halfway through the game you'll run into gremlins, which can steal half of your food in a single turn. The gremlins are often considered by Akalabeth veterans to be the most dangerous enemy in the game, and for good reason. It's easy for them to diminish your food count to a point where you have no way to escape and are doomed to starvation. This sounds annoying, and to be fair, it kind of is, but I think the gremlin is this game's one subtle stroke of creative genius. I'm not sure if it was intentional or not, and maybe it doesn't matter, but the gremlin is introduced to players at the perfect time. The gremlin first shows up on floor 6, and at that point in the game you're probably pretty confident in your ability to fight. Because at this point you've killed so many monsters, you have more than enough money to buy a shit ton of food and just completely rid your mind of the hunger mechanic altogether. Then the next thing you know, this little motherfucker shows up, starts stealing your shit, and you're left with a fractured sense of security. Unfortunately, past this point in the game there's only one more enemy with a gimmick, and that's the mimic chests. Sadly, they aren't nearly as impressive because as soon as you fall for your first one, you know you should probably just stay on guard when approaching chests, and they have no special abilities to functionally make them different from the rest of the enemies you encounter. The final boss itself, a Balrog, is disappointing. He looks pretty impressive, but from a gameplay perspective he's just a slightly stronger enemy with a huge amount of HP. Then you make your way out, tell Lord British what you did, and the game is over. You're a knight now. You're free to keep playing, this time without a goal, but there's not much of a point. Now, there's a way to get to that ending in a very short amount of time that I've been hinting at for a little bit now. Like I said previously, there is no reason to play as a fighter over a mage in Akalabeth. The magical amulet, which the mage can control while the fighter can't, is the most powerful item in the game by far. The amulet has 4 different spells attached to it. You can cast an offensive laser beam, and while it does good damage, it doesn't often hit, so it's kinda useless. You can also summon a ladder leading to the dungeon floor above or below you, which completely eliminates the dungeon crawling aspect of the game, and works as a near instantaneous escape option for surrounded players. Now, amulets do degrade and break over time, but there really is nothing stopping you from buying a couple right off the bat and making it to the final floor in a few minutes. You won't live long, but hey, you can do it. The final option is curiously titled Bad, and has a number of miscellaneous, mostly negative effects on the player. Even if you are a mage, this spell's effect will always remain random. It's possible to damage yourself or accidentally turn yourself into a toad, which reduces your stats to ridiculously low scores and practically makes the game unwinnable. But it can't be all bad, right? Sure enough, one of these random effects is turning your character into a lizard man. Functionally, this is the opposite of turning into a toad, with all your stats being raised to astronomical levels that go beyond even that of endgame characters. There are even RNG manipulation strategies that allow players to stack this effect and turn into a lizard man over and over again until their stats reach even higher values, but I frankly don't see why anyone would feel the need to do so. By the time you turn into a lizard man once, you're nearly unstoppable. Just use the amulet to summon a chain of ladders down to lower floors, kill what you need to kill, report back to Lord British, rinse and repeat, and you've won. This takes at most 30 minutes to get going, and it's absurd in how trivial it makes the game. You would think that Lord British would react to the fact you made yourself into a monster for the sake of completing his mission, but the game's a little too simple to take a variable like that into account. It would be neat to see players who resort to this method receiving an alternate ending where Lord British denies them knighthood because they sacrificed their humanity for the sake of their quest. Later Ultima games would deal with ethical and moral issues such as this, but maybe it doesn't do us much good to retroactively prescribe this sort of thinking into Garriot's older releases. There's already a lack of meaningful story in Akalabeth, and while that doesn't mean it's not worth exploring what is there with a critical lens, it's obvious that the game is more of an experiment in gameplay design rather than a test of interactive storytelling. With that in mind, I don't truly care about the fact the game doesn't address my horrific lizard man transformation, but it is kind of funny to imagine a lizard man playing chutes and ladders to kill a Balrog. Overall, I can't say that my time with Akalabeth was that enjoyable. It helps that it's now free, and I respect it as a historical object, but the game was just a little too simplistic and busted for me to have a lot of fun with it. What I did find rewarding in the experience is a general feeling of how little has changed when it comes to amateur game development. It was real interesting to see mistakes such as unbalanced class options and overpowered equipment selection being a thing even decades ago. These are the same sorts of mistakes you see even today when new creators first try their hand at making a game. You see it all the time in RPG Maker projects. It may seem obvious, but it just goes to show that like any other art form, there always have been and always will be common struggles that new creators face when constructing a role-playing game. So would I recommend Akalabeth World of Doom? Probably not. There's not too much to really gain from the experience other than a quick curious glance at what early video games were like. Talking about it is surely more interesting than actually playing it. But if you do find yourself curious, and you find yourself with an itch to explore some of gaming history, go ahead and give it a download. Like I said, it's a free download on GOG.com, so there's not really much to lose other than a bit of your time. It's archaic, it's unbalanced, it's a relic of an older time, but it was influential, and to some degree it deserves respect. Thank you for watching the first episode of RPG Rewind. I hope you enjoyed it. This was my first time recording an analytical video this long and detailed, and it was a lot of fun. Next time, I'll be taking a look at the first Mana game in its 3 iterations: Final Fantasy Adventure, Sword of Mana, and The Adventures of Mana. If you're curious if I'll ever revisit Richard Garriott's work, I do plan to play through the Ultima games at some point and taking a look at those as well. I'm also in the process of playing through Persona 5, but due to restrictions in place by the game's publisher, that analysis will be written as a blog post instead of a video review. Though I will upload a video with a link to the post once it's up. Thanks for watching, and I hope you look forward to my upcoming videos as much as I look forward to making them. Have a good night.